going to call this raucous group of Presbyterians order. Remember, we do everything decently and in good order. So I'm going to ask you to come and grab a seat. You know, there's always more to talk about and more to share than we typically have time for. So I want to try to start right on time today. I got a question already.
No,
Go and sin no more, my child.
I need that. No, I had an announcement that the Circle 4 still has some things left, and they are in the lobby. And so in between now and church or after church, you can go by and buy the rest of it. What's
And
left.
my understanding is last year it got canceled because of COVID.
Right.
So I imagine a lot of people are longing for those soups and breads and snacks and so forth. And y'all better get out of my way after service. After the presentation, I'll be looking for that. Okay. Well, it hardly seems possible. This is our fourth and our final session together. And for those of you who are new today, let me just say that we decided to look at the founders of other faiths during this particular offering of Kaleidoscope. That's an unusual thing to do, as I know typically in the past you studied a biblical book together, bringing together all the Sunday school classes where you dealt with some particular Christian topic. So to deal with founders of other faiths, I know that's new. And I was advised that might be a little bit of a stretch in terms of what normally is done. But thank you, because you're willing to do that stretch with me. And I really enjoyed it. And I want to thank publicly Kyle and Brad for asking me to do this. Now, a couple of you asked me, they said, who are you? And did you used to teach at Lander and they kicked you out? Or what's going on here? No, I worship at this church with all of you. And I moved here about a year ago from Missouri, or as they say there, Missouri. So I moved from Missouri here to South Carolina. I am a retired professor, but I taught at Westminster College in Missouri, which is the one where Winston Churchill gave the famous Iron Curtain speech. There was a Iron Curtain descending on, when was it, March 3rd or 6th in 1946. So I'm a Presbyterian, a clergy person, but I've had my life always in academics, and I've always lived my life at the intersection of faith and reason, or the academy and the church. That's always been fun. And somebody asked me also, they said, we heard you're an environmental scientist. Well, 2 years ago, I went back to school because I was concerned about how our Christian faith might be applied to solving environmental problems. Did it have a role to play? And I suspected that it did. When I read the Bible, it seemed to me we had some obligations God was placing on us to take good care of the earth, which we've not really done such a good job of heretofore. So I went back to school and got a doctorate in environmental science. So yes, I am a scientist, please forgive me, but I'm also trained as a theologian. So why have we been doing founders of faith? Why have we looked at Moshe, that is Moses? Why have we looked at Muhammad the prophet, peace be upon him? Why have we looked at Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism? And why are we going to be looking at Confucius today? Well, I think there are several reasons, and I'll quickly just say these. I've shared them before, I'm going to do it again. You don't have to leave the sacred turf of Greenwood, South Carolina to discover people who come from different faith traditions. My cardiologist is Hindu. I was having dinner at Pascal's a couple of weeks ago, and some folks at the adjacent table were Jewish. Speaking of Jewish, my attorney back in Indianapolis is a Jew. One of my best friends at the university where I taught in Missouri was Muslim. I think you're getting what I'm trying to say to you. We have people in our lives, acquaintances, friends, co-workers, people who live in the same neighborhoods or the same retirement villages or whatever who may come from different faith traditions. Secondly, I think when you look across the United States and the villages and towns and cities, we suddenly see the minarets of mosques, and we see the temples of Buddhist places of worship. We see a number of synagogues or temples. So what used to really be a landscape that was dominated by church spires, church steeples, now we share the horizon. We're not the only show in town like we were a number of decades ago. I think also, and this is very personal for me to share it, my own Christian faith has been enriched. It's been enhanced by knowing people who came from other faith traditions, because it forced me to think, okay, that's not where I want to go, or that's not what I think. What do I think? And can I articulate that and understand that in a much deeper and sharper way? So I've benefited from conversations and relationships with people who come from different faith traditions. And lastly, when people sometimes ask me, who are you? And I can say, well, I'm a father. My son is visiting me this weekend from Indiana, so I'm a father. I'm a former professor. I used to be a basketball player. To my son, I'd say that's the really good sport and not football like you play. But I'm a Christian. And if you don't know that about me, and you don't understand that about me, then you don't know me. Well, if that works for Christianity, think what that would mean then for people coming from other faith traditions. If I don't know what it means for my cardiologist here in Greenwood to be Hindu, I don't know him. And trust me, since he takes a look at my ticker and making sure it's working properly, I want to know this guy really, really well. So I think for these reasons, it's very helpful for us to be able to understand where other people are coming from. What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be a Muslim? What does it mean to be a Buddhist? Or today, what does it mean to be a Confucian? So today, we talk about Confucius, that is Confucius. The first thing we have to understand, if we're going to take a look at Confucius, is that Chinese religion is not as neat and tidy as is Christianity or other Western religious traditions. Now, I told you earlier I'm a Christian. That means I'm not Jewish. I'm not a Muslim. I'm a Christian. But in China, you can follow several different religions simultaneously. You can be a Confucian and a Buddhist, and let's say a Taoist simultaneously. And the great world religion scholar Houston Smith once said, he was in China, and he saw a guy walking toward him, and he noticed he had on a Buddhist scarf. And he said to that person, oh, you're a Buddhist. And the guy pointed to his Taoist cap. And Houston Smith said, oh, you're a Taoist. And he pointed to his Confucian shoes. So you simultaneously can be, believe it or not, a Confucian, a Taoist, and a Buddhist in China. And these religious traditions address slightly different concerns. The Taoist is concerned about our relationship to the greater nature, to the cosmos, if you will. A Buddhist is concerned about afterlife. How are you going to come back? How are you going to live your life, you ex-Marine, in this particular tradition? And then lastly, how are you going to relate to one another as human beings? What's the proper way to interact? Well, that's Confucianism. So you can be Confucian and a Taoist and a Buddhist all at the same time. Well, what about Confucius? What about Confucius? Well, he was born a long time ago. Born in 551 BC, late September in 551 BC, and he dies in April of 479 BC. A terribly chaotic time in Chinese history. Widespread poverty. The warlords had factions fighting against one another. There was an anemic central government. So Confucius will always be pointing toward a strong central government, as opposed to the Taoists who think that government is best which governs least. I think that's kind of like the Republican point of view today. The Democrats would say that government is best which governs the most. Anyway, the point is, Confucius, because of this situation, he's going to say, we need a stronger government. And lastly, life is very cheap. So how are you going to live in the midst of this kind of situation? Ready for this one? Confucius is the product of the union of an ex-military soldier whose name is Kong. He's 71 years old, and his concubine, who is Yan Shen Zai, who is 17 years old. Now, I'm laughing a little bit because I'm the oldest of my family, and now my birthday's on Tuesday. I guess I just turned about 16. Which is in eastern China. At the time he was born, there were a few thousand people living there. Today there are 700,000. These are not the gates from the 6th century BC when he was born. These are the gates from the Ming dynasty that you can see in Khufu today. This is a wonderful, wonderful picture of Confucius playing with his mother. His dad dies when he's 3 years old. I can identify with that too. My dad died when I was almost 3 years old. And then his mother dies when he's 23. He's 23. So Kong Shu, Kong family name, Shu, his first name, he's got a rough life. He does not have it easy. He's an orphan in the sense that when your dad died in those times, that was a really bad thing because the man was really the center of finance and also of power. And his mother dies, of course, when he's how old? 23. He's illegitimate because this is a union between his dad and his concubine. I mean, Kong He had 9 other children who were daughters, and then he had one son who was physically challenged, physically deformed. So it wasn't like Confucius was the only one. He's also very poor because even though his dad was ex-military, there was poverty throughout the entire country of China. And he's unattractive. He's unattractive. I don't have time to tell you this story, but I'm going to anyway. I want to preserve a lot of time at the end for your questions as well. Either questions about today's presentation or any of the other presentations we've had previously. I used to be a college coach, and we were at an away kind of event, and the cheerleaders from the other team came over. And I thought they were going to do one of those nice little cheers that say, we all want to tell you we're glad you're here. Hello. We say, hi. That wasn't the cheer. They started saying, you ugly. We want to say you ugly. You UGLY, you ugly. So whenever I think about poor Confucius being ugly, I think about that experience I had years ago as a university coach. So he had all these challenges, these kinds of formidable obstacles in front of him, but smart. He was a voracious reader. His mom was concerned about his education and made him go to see the village tutor. Hey, that reminds me of my mom too. She never never had a chance to go to college, and she said to me, "You will go to college. I don't care where, you will go." And so I could just imagine Confucius' mom saying to him, "You're going to college. I don't care where it is, but you're going to college." So he met with the village tutor, and he became a teacher himself. And at the height of his career, OMG, oh my Confucius, he had 3,000 students. So, Zong Shu, family name Kong, first name Shu, becomes Confucius. He becomes Master Kong. So Confucius is simply his last name combined with the title of being a teacher. Remember what we said about the Buddha a couple weeks ago, right? Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. The Buddha is not his name, the Buddha is his title. Or Jesus the Christ. Christ is not Jesus' name, Christ is Jesus' title. Messiah, Mashiach, Christ, Christos, right? So for Confucius, he becomes known as Kong, the philosopher, or Kong, the teacher. When the Jesuits came to China in the 16th century, the early 16th century, they tried to put his name from Chinese characters into Latin characters, and it became Confucius. He never would have heard the name Confucius in his entire life, but that's the name by way of which we refer to him today. So moving along really quickly, because I really value the time at the end for questions and answers. This is a shot I took of a Confucian temple. And Confucius is not worshipped as a god, but he is revered as a spirit. He is idolized as the great teacher that he was.
Dr. King,
Yes, please.
what distinguishes that temple from a Buddhist or a Taoist or other temples?
Thank you. Did y'all hear the question? What would distinguish this temple from being a Taoist temple or from being a Buddhist temple? In the Buddhist temple, you got figures of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. In a Taoist temple, you've got a big drum and some other instruments that really make an appeal to the creative energy in the universe called the Tao, hence Taoism, yin and yang. And then in a Confucian temple, there are some statues of Confucius. And you might be saying, well, how do they worship in there? Well, there's bowing and kneeling, they light incense, there are some rituals that they also follow together. But the key thing would be, do you see a statue of Confucius? Do you see Confucius in that particular temple? What a great question, thank you for asking. I love dragons. And so from the top of one of the temples, when I was up there with my Nikon, I was able to shoot that particular picture. Inside a Confucian temple sanctuary, Confucianism doesn't say there are no gods. Confucianism doesn't say there's no divine reality. They just say, we're going to focus on human relations. So they don't deny the gods, they just don't really talk about them. Well, the sayings of Confucius are all collected by his disciples into a book called the Lun Yu, or the Analects. And one of his most famous sayings is, when one of his disciples asked him, is there one word that kind of sums up all your teaching and, is the way we ought to try to live in the world? And he responded, is not reciprocity, that particular word. That is, what you don't want done to you, don't do to other people. Well, friends, what's that? That's the golden rule. He also said a few other things, and I just lifted these out because these struck me. Respect yourself, and others will respect you. Hold faithfulness and sincerity as first principles. I find this one very interesting. To be wealthy and honored in an unjust society is a disgrace. I like this one too. Never give a sword to a man who can't dance. Or based on my son being a a quarterback, don't throw the football to a player who can't catch it. Not that ever would have happened to you. Another one, when the wind blows, the grass bends. I like to kind of remember that one. When the wind blows, the grass kind of bends, you kind of adjust to things. Or this last one, it's kind of a long saying, but boy, I like this, especially as an ex-professor. He who knows and knows that he knows is a wise man. Follow him. He who knows not and knows not that he knows not is a fool. Shun him. Yeah, I like that one too. Well, what did Confucius say then about what we were going to do about human relations? How are we going to live in a particular time when there's widespread poverty, there are warring factions, life is cheap, the government can't do anything? How are we going to live? Well, he said we're going to live by cultivating proper relationships among our human interactions. And he had 5 of them. They're called the 5 Li. Not the 5 lie, but the 5 Li. And the first one is parent and child. Son, pay attention to this. Respect your parents. Honor your father and mother, to say that in a Jewish Christian kind of way, right? My obligation is to raise you as a decent human being. Well, nice try, Cliff. And your responsibility is to respect your father, right? To respect your mother. Then what about parent and parent? Well, back in Confucius's time, it was a little bit sexist. Women, brothers and sisters in Christ, the man had the word and he was going to declare what things were going to be like, and the woman was going to be obedient. Well, that's the 6th century BC. It's not the 6th century BC now, so it's more of an equal kind of notion. You're going to have mutual respect for one another. Sibling and sibling. The older sibling has a special responsibility for the younger sibling, and the younger sibling has a special responsibility for the elder. I need to take care of my little sister Jan. Not always an easy proposition, but I, in a way, am responsible for her because I'm the elder. And she needs to show some respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, to her older brother, by golly, and I hope that starts soon. Ruler and subject, the emperor, the ruler, has a responsibility to always have the best interests of the subjects at heart. And the subjects, therefore, need to be responsible to the emperor. And lastly, friend to friend. This is a general kind of term, friend to friend. It can mean business associate to business associate. It can mean friend to friend. It can mean people in your neighborhood. But typically, you look after one another. And here's an interesting thing. The older person, in a sense, deserves a certain degree of deference. And the younger person has a kind of obligation to supply that respect, while the older person has a certain responsibility to look after and to role model the best of the Confucian virtues to the younger. 2 very, very quick stories to share about that. When I was a young professor, I know what you're thinking, boy, that was a long time ago, wasn't it? But when I was a young professor, my first faculty meeting, I had opinions about a certain topic that came up for discussion at the faculty meeting. And so I blurted out something. The faculty meeting ended. About 20 minutes after it ended, I noticed probably the oldest professor on the faculty standing at my door. He was at least 325 years of age. And he looked at me and he said, "Young fella," I thought, uh-oh, "you've been at this place for 2 months. I've been at this place for 45 years. Your place is to talk when the others of us who are your elders who have given to this place for 40 years have had our say." I got the message. Now, this wasn't a Confucian college, this wasn't a Confucian society, but that was a Confucian value. You let your elders speak first. You don't cease to speak, but you show respect for those who have given service and time and have gained wisdom at your particular institution. Other quick story to illustrate. I represented my university once in Hong Kong. Our president couldn't go, so it was a meeting of a bunch of presidents. So there I am with all the bigwigs. And I get onto an elevator on like the 10th floor to go all the way up to the top floor. And people are on the elevator, and I go up all the way to the top floor, and I get off, and nobody else gets off. And then the elevator starts back down. What's going on? Surely these people were going to be getting off before I got off, right? I go to the top floor. Everybody stays on, and nobody gets off at the top floor. So I asked the president of Hong Kong University, I said, what's going on? He said, you were the oldest person on the elevator. And they were showing respect and deference to you. So they weren't going to get off until you got off. And I thought, oh, that's really great getting older, isn't it? Anyway, so that's kind of a general friend to friend. It can mean business associate, a business associate, neighbor and neighbor. It can mean actual people who are friends in those kinds of committed relationships. If you do all this, Confucius said, that's going to provide harmony in the society. There's going to be a harmonious society that exists as a result. Moving on quickly. For us Christians, what's the key moral virtue? Kyle talked about it in the 9 o'clock service this morning. What's the chief Christian moral virtue? Thank you. It's love. It's love. The chief moral virtue for Confucianism is Ren. Ren. And probably the best translation of Ren is to say empathy. Empathy. Can you be so attuned to the situation and the needs of others that your heart is able to be extended to that person? In fact, the Chinese character for Ren is actually two circles that intersect the heart. And that's what Ren is. So, Confucianism wants to say that for yourself. And that's where it starts. But it doesn't stop there. Because if it stops with you, then that sympathy, that empathy, that Ren is egocentric. It's all about you. And Confucianism says it starts with you, but it doesn't end there. Well, if then empathy goes beyond you to one's family, is that a good thing? You can be empathic to other members of your family. Try to understand this and that about your spouse, the person with whom you are in a committed relationship, your children. Yeah, that's a good thing. But wait, if it stops there, then it's nepotism. You know, you'll never be the king of England. I know you want to be, but you're not going to because it's got to stay in the family, right? And so you're not a member of the royal family, so guess what? You ain't going to be the king of England. So if compassion, if empathy, if sympathy, if Ren stops with the family, then it becomes nepotism, right? So then it's got to go to your community. Empathy's got to reach out to others in the community in which you find yourself. But wait, if it stops there, then it's parochialism, right? So then it's got to go towards your province or your state. And Confucius was from the state of Lu, L-U. So the empathy, the compassion, the sympathy, the Ren had to then go out to the entire province or the state. But wait, if it stops there, that's regionalism, right? So then it's got to go out toward the nation. But wait, if it stops there, it's just nationalism. So if you could think of Ren or empathy, compassion, sympathy being like a rock that you throw into a pond, and the ripples begin to go out from where that rock struck it, and finally you see the ripples encompassing the whole pond, that then becomes the Confucian goal. Empathy starts with you, and it goes to all of life. Well, some differences between Confucianism and our own Christian faith. Well, first of all, Confucius did not deny the existence of the gods, but he didn't talk about it. And we Christians talk about God, and we regard God as a very present help in times of trouble. And we believe that God plays a crucial role in our lives in the world. Confucius wanted to talk about human relationships. He didn't want to talk about the gods. Didn't deny them, just didn't want to talk about them. Secondly, Confucianism is concerned mainly with developing a harmonious society on earth. He's concerned about life on earth. And we are too. We are too. We're concerned about working with God to build a greater semblance of the kingdom of God on earth. But we also believe that that's not the end of it. Right? We also believe that we are called to an everlasting life with God, however we in particular might understand that. So it occurs to me a couple important differences between Christianity and Confucianism. Well, there are some similarities as well. There are differences, there are similarities. And already we've talked about the golden rule, right? In Confucianism, do not do to others what you wish others not to do to you. That's a negative version of our golden rule as Christians. Do unto others what you would have others do unto you. So the golden rule is present in both religious traditions. Secondly, Confucianism elevates empathy. We've talked about this before, as the highest moral virtue, and we Christians emphasize agape, or agape, you can pronounce it either way in Greek, agape or agape. Are those two somewhat related to one another? If I love someone, if I try to have empathy for where that person is and what that person's feeling and thinking, they're not synonyms, but maybe they're kissing cousins between Confucianism and Christianity. And lastly, I think this is very important. Confucius was a very, very humble individual. He taught humility and he lived it out. Oh my goodness, this sounds like my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who said what? The humble, he says the meek, but the humble shall inherit the earth. Sometimes I look at the world, I'm not sure why they would want it, but the meek shall inherit the earth, the humble shall persevere. And then Jesus not only teaches that, he lives that out. And I remember, that passage from Philippians chapter 2, you remember it? Have this mind among yourselves, which you find in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. And being found in human form, he humbled himself even unto death on the cross. By the way, I don't see Steve Skinner here, but that's the oldest hymn in the Christian church. We don't know the notes. We don't know the notes, but those are the words. The oldest hymn in the Christian church. Well, because I believe that having conversations with people coming from other faith traditions can actually help us learn something we didn't know before, or maybe help us recover something that is in our own Christian tradition. What could such a relationship, a conversation, an appreciation of Confucianism do for us as Christians? Well, I'm starting with the man in the mirror. Remember that song? From the somewhat disgraced now, Michael Jackson. I'm starting with the man in the mirror. You're gonna change the world, what do you gotta do? Change yourself. You gotta change you. So that's why I put SIC after man in the mirror, because it's not just men. I'm starting with the person I see in the mirror. Can I change my life? I remember then the quote of Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. And 2 months ago, Dr. HIte provided us a sermon, and it struck me. I kept thinking, he's saying a kind of Confucian thing, but as Christian. And that is, he was basically saying, what are you going to do looking at the world? You tune in the news every night, you get what? Depressed. I have to watch reruns of Frasier so I can laugh late at night. Otherwise, I'm just simply depressed, right? What do I do about that? And Kyle told us 2 months ago, you start with you. You start with you. Can you be a loving, kind, tolerant, understanding person? Maybe that's where the change starts. It starts with you. And lastly, for me as an environmental scientist, I'm always touched by this. It's the same thing is the case in Buddhism as well as in Confucianism. And that is this expression of empathy, this Ren, has to extend to all living things, not just to our particular species, which is technically Homo sapiens sapient. It has to extend to all living things. So from a Confucian point of view, how you treat the neighborhood dog is important, not to mention how I treat all of you. Well, we're almost at the end and time for some questions. Good. And those who have to zip away to choir, and tell Steve about that ancient hymn from Philippians 2. You probably already know. Okay. About 4 years ago, in China, in his hometown of Khufu, in the state or province of Lu, they erected an incredibly huge statue honoring Confucius. It's made out of brass, 236 feet high, and it simply towers over the community. So I thought you'd like to see that. That's the statue from a distance, and that's a little more up close. Well, quickly, in these 4 sessions together, we've been talking about learning things about founders of other faiths. You're probably wondering what kind of theological position is available regarding how we then occupy a stance regarding people of other faith traditions. And I think there are at least 3. And I'm not going to tell you which one you choose for yourselves. That's up to you. You're big people. You have freedom of conscience. You have spiritual maturity. You can decide for yourselves. But it seems to me there are really 3 that are available. And I'll tip my hand and say the last one happens to be my own personal point of view. And the first one we can call exclusivism. Exclusivism would say, no other religion besides Christianity has anything in it to be a Christian. Other religious traditions are worthless. And if that's your point of view, that's okay, because a number of Christians would occupy that particular position. The second one would be relativism, and that says, I sound like Bill Murray in that old movie Meatballs, when they're doing that competition among the camps. He's trying to relax his campers because they're nervous about the competition to see which camp in that area is going to be the best. And so it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. With relativism, it just doesn't matter. The last one I'm going to call pluralism. And pluralism basically says there can be truth and value in other religions. But as a Christian, I've chosen to follow Christ. Worthless. Does that make sense? Other religious traditions can be worth less than my Christian faith to me, but those other religious traditions are not completely worthless. Now, here I'm not alone in saying that. The person after whom I endowed Charity University, his name C.S. Lewis, said exactly the same thing. He said, I appreciate other religious and philosophical traditions, but as for me, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Quoting what? Gospel of John. Right? Finally, your questions. And we've got, let's see, I've got about 20 before the hour. So we've probably got about 10 or 15 minutes before those of us who did not go to first service can go to second. Start us off, yeah.
Two things. That plan is really interesting. How does that conflict with the Hindu caste? My next question is, I'm not worried about other religions, I'm worried about atheists.
Okay. His question is this notion of the chief moral virtue being rank. How would that impact a Hindu point of view with the caste system? And your second question was, you're not so worried about other religions as much as you are worried about atheism rather than other theisms or other religions. Those questions deserve a long answer, and I can't give you that. So let me give you the beginnings of an answer. I think, first of all, Hinduism, and someday ask me to talk about Hinduism. It doesn't have a founder. That's why I couldn't deal with it this time. Hinduism has no founder, but 1 billion people follow it. One of them being my cardiologist. So ask me sometime to talk maybe 4 series just on Hinduism. And Hinduism is a caste system that is based on the circumstances of your birth. You are in a particular caste. You're a Brahmana, a Kshatriya, a Vaishya, or a Shudra, or you're an outcast.
You can tell by the last name.
And you can tell by last names which caste you belong to. From a Confucian point of view, that simply is unfair, unequal, and ought to be not tolerated. And even Mohandas Gandhi himself, probably the most famous Hindu of all time, had a very strong distaste for caste. So Confucianism and Buddhism before that we talked about, which Buddhism was kind of an offshoot of Hinduism, it became its own religion, it would criticize the caste system, and Confucianism was too. The second part of your question was, you're not worried so much about the Buddhists and the Confucians and the Jews and the Muslims, are you, as you are worried about the atheists. Sometime ask me to do a 4-part series on that as well, because this may sound, an atheistic point of view basically says, I don't suspect there is no God. I know there's no God. I'm going to live my life in a way that doesn't have any room for God in my picture of the universe. I think that's an incredible challenge to those of us who would say we are not atheistic, we are theistic. We are theistic. But I've benefited from talking with and reading the materials of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, who are the 4 most prominent atheist philosophers of the day. And they have helped me to articulate more clearly to myself and perhaps more persuasively to others some aspects of my Christian faith. So Chris Hitchens, for example, who died a couple of years ago, Hitch and I had some very interesting conversations. And he was pretty relentless in saying this God talk is all nonsense. And he said, you know, there is no God in the heaven who has a long white beard, and is working like an electric train set, and says, oh, tragedy there, oh, lightning storm there. And I said, well, you're right, it's not. He looked at me like I was from Mars. And I said, you know, Chris, the definition of God that you're using, the concept you're using, is irrelevant to most of us Christians today. That's not what we think. Which of you thinks that God is an old man in the sky with a long beard? I mean, come on, right? So I said to Chris, and he didn't like it. I said, if that's the only concept of God that's available to me, then guess what? I'm an atheist too. He said, oh my God, I thought you were a Presbyterian. I thought you were a clergyman. And I said, well, again, our pictures of God have resources, right? And then, how many cathedrals have I been in where I've seen God pictured as someone who's an old man with white hair and long beard? So, whereas I feel challenged by the new atheists, the four of them, I don't find myself totally overwhelmed by them because they help me articulate my Christian faith in a way that is more satisfying for me, and I think it can be helpful for others. Next question. I'm sorry, that's a long answer. Please, sir.
I have a friend that's a Unitarian Universalist.
Yes, sir.
Tell me about that.
Oh, okay. Gee, I'm not trying to conjure up some work for myself here, but sometimes asking to talk about different traditions that have some roots in Christianity that may be a little different. If you're a Unitarian Universalist, you basically say that there is a divine reality out there and it's singular. Therefore, Jesus is a great moral teacher. And if you followed him, your life would have meaning. But salvation comes to all because all of the religious paths lead to redemption or salvation. That's where the universalism comes in. So being a Unitarian Universalist means there's only one divine reality, and all paths that are religious end up at the same goal. But that deserves a lot more. On the positive side, as I work with some Unitarian Universalists, they have a real sense of obligation to work for justice in the society and to try to combat things like racism, right, and sexism and anti-Semitism or environmental degradation. So I find that I sometimes can work across boundaries because we have a common cause, even though we don't have an identical theology. Does that make some sense? You know, I sometimes work to do some good things with other people who disagree with me sharply theologically, but we find common ground in trying to do good things. We've got a little more time. Yes, please, ma'am. Oh, thank you for that question. Did you hear it? She said, is Confucianism really a religion? Well, even among scholars, sometimes there's a debate. Is it a religion or is it a philosophy of life? And some people say it's a philosophy of life because it doesn't talk about God. It talks more about human relations. Let me just say this about that. From my perspective, and I have my bias, it's a religion. Because depending on how you define religion, it qualifies for this. So you might be saying, well, what's your definition of religion then? Well, my definition of religion is personal transformation in the face of perceived ultimacy. I'm not sure I can say it again. Do you know how complicated that was? Personal transformation in the face of perceived ultimacy. What do you think is the ultimate? Is it God? Is it human relations? Is it, like the Hindus, gods, plural? Is it Buddha? Is it Nirvana? And then your personal transformation in the face of that and in response to it. And the reason why I put it that way is this. There are some of my religious studies colleagues who say, Confucianism is not really a religion. It's just a philosophy of life. And so by identifying as a philosophy of life, they denigrate it. It's not like Christianity, that's a real religion. We believe in God, we have things about Jesus and the church. And I say, wait a second. the way you're naming it allows you then to relegate it to a lower status. It's just a philosophy of life. Here's the contrast. Oh gosh, it was probably about 15 years ago. I gave lectures at 7 Chinese universities about the Christian faith. And I titled it, Introduction to Christian Theology. And nobody came. Unlike you, who have been faithful to me and loyal with me for these 4 sessions, even interrupted by COVID in between, nobody was there. And I said to my host, I said, what's going on? Thinking like they didn't do their homework, they didn't publicize it, they didn't encourage it, they didn't require their students to come from the universities. And they said, religion is something that is old school. It's out of date. It's superstitious. Oh, I said, how should I retitle my talk? Introduction to the Christian Philosophy of Life. And the auditorium was packed. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a certain cultural bias here, right? We would probably say Confucianism, and no, it's just a philosophy of life. It's not really a religion. From their perspective, calling something a religion demoted it, and calling it a philosophy of life lifted it up and celebrated. So I didn't change my talk 1 iota. The talk was the same, but it was talking about the Christian philosophy of life, which had greater value for them, the Chinese, than did the term religion, archaic, superstitious, old school. Chairman Mao told us that stuff way back in 1966 or 1976, that stuff was all bogus anyway.